quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in. Let the outside world dissolve and gently descend into tonight's world. In the mid-1990s, a small school in rural Zimbabwe became the center of a story that still echoes. A group of children later described seeing something unusual near their playground. Over time, the incident gathered interviews, TV segments, skeptics, and believers. Some accounts stayed consistent, and some details shifted with retelling. What remains most clear is not a single proven explanation, but a human moment that was recorded in real time, revisited years later, and argued about ever since. Tonight, we explore the Ariel School incident. The place is called Ruwa. It sits not far from Harare in Zimbabwe. If you picture the country on a map, you can imagine a broad plateau, dry grasslands, and long roads that stretch through farm areas. In 1994, Zimbabwe was only a little more than a decade past independence. The nation was still finding its footing in many ways, and families in places like Ruwa were living ordinary lives that mixed old routines with new changes. Ariel School was a private primary school. It had classrooms, a yard, and a simple playground area. The school day had the same shape that many school days have. Children arrived, they learned, they waited for break, they ran outside, they ate snacks, they talked, they played games. The details of that day matter, because this story is not about a remote lab or a military base. It is about a schoolyard, a place that is supposed to feel safe and familiar. The date most often given is September 16th, 1994. It was late morning. Teachers were inside a staff meeting or in class, depending on which account you read. Many sources say the older children were outside during break with limited direct adult supervision. The children were not alone in the sense of being abandoned, but they were not being watched closely every second. Near the edge of the school grounds, there was an area with brush and trees. Some accounts describe it as a little wild, a place the children knew they were not supposed to go. In many schools, there is some border like this, a fence, a hedge, a line where the neat part ends and the rough part begins. The details of the fence line and the exact distance are debated, but the basic idea is the same. There was the playground and there was the beyond. At some point, several children noticed something unusual. The first reports describe a strange craft, or something that landed, or something that hovered low to the ground. Some describe it as silver. Some describe it as dark. Some call it a disc. Some say it was more like an oval. A few describe lights. A few describe a kind of shimmer. Then there is the second piece of the story, and it is the part that makes the Ariel School incident stand apart. The children did not only describe a craft. Many also described seeing one or more beings near it. The descriptions are not identical. That is important. They are children, and they are describing a frightening and confusing moment. Even adults who witness the same car crash can disagree on basic facts. With children, the range can be wider. Still, there are common threads. Many children described a small figure. Some said it was short. Some said it moved in a strange way, almost like gliding. Some said it had a large head. Some said the eyes were big and dark. Some described a tight black suit or a dark body. Some described long black hair. Some described no hair. You might already feel two different reactions at once. One reaction is curiosity. If a group of children, independent of each other, describe similar shapes and similar feelings, You might think there is something there. The other reaction is doubt. You might think about cartoons, movies, and the way alien imagery had already entered pop culture long before 1994. Both reactions are normal. The story lives in the space between them. What do we know that is solid? We know there was a report. We know the school acknowledged something happened because the school contacted people and journalists showed up. We know interviews were recorded not long after the event. Those early interviews are valuable because they happened before decades of documentaries, podcasts, and online debate. One of the main early media pieces was made by a Zimbabwean TV program. It is often referenced because it shows children speaking and drawing pictures. You can see their faces, hear their words, and notice what they seem to struggle to describe. Drawings are another key part. Several children made drawings of the craft and the beings. The drawings vary, but again, there are repeating motifs. Oval shapes, small figures, big eyes, dark forms. In later years, an American psychiatrist named John Mack became involved. Mack was a Harvard professor, and he became known for interviewing people who reported alien abductions. His involvement brings more attention, but it also brings controversy, because he already had an interest in these kinds of claims. Mack traveled to Zimbabwe and interviewed some of the children. He recorded sessions. He asked them to describe what happened. The children talked about fear, about the craft, about the beings. Some talked about a feeling of a message. The alleged message is often described as being about the environment, about technology, or about the future. People sometimes repeat it as if it was a clear speech. But in the interviews, it often sounds more like an impression, a feeling, or a thought that came into their minds. That matters. Human memory does not store experiences like a video camera. We store fragments, emotions, and meanings. When we recall the event, we rebuild it. We put words on feelings. We fill gaps. We create a story that fits. So a careful approach is to treat the message as a reported impression, not as a confirmed statement. It is what some children remember feeling. It is not a direct quotation from a known speaker. Another detail in the broader context is that, around the same time, there were reports across parts of southern Africa of unusual lights in the sky. Some people connect these reports to the school incident. The reasoning is simple. If many people saw strange lights around that date, perhaps something was going on in the sky. But correlation is not causation. The lights could be something ordinary. They could be meteors. They could be re-entering debris. They could be aircraft. Or they could be something unknown. Some events arrive like weather. They do not ask permission. They do not explain themselves. They simply enter a place, change the shape of the air for a moment, and then leave. The Ariel School story has that feeling. A normal school day, a normal yard, and then something that does not fit. Not just something unusual, but something that feels extraordinary. Something that presses against the edges of what we think the world is allowed to do. In stories like this, people often rush to tidy explanations. The mind wants a label because labels feel safe. But the witnesses did not describe a tidy thing. They described a moment when the world seemed to open, just a crack, a craft close to the ground, a presence, a figure that did not move like an ordinary person, eyes that felt too large, too dark, too direct, and a sense, reported by some, of meaning arriving without words. Even if the details vary, the atmosphere remains. The atmosphere is the clue. It is the feeling of standing near something that is not built for human understanding. For the children, the fear was immediate. Fear that was not a story. Fear that was in the body, a dry mouth, a tight chest, the instinct to run, the instinct to stare, the instinct to look away, the instinct to look again. And then, after the moment is gone, the strange second wave, the wave where reality returns, but it returns with a new crack in it. If you say it was real, you may be mocked. If you say it was not, you may feel like you are erasing your own memory. If you say you do not know, people may push you to choose anyway. That pressure can follow a witness for years. And the strangest part is that none of it settles the original moment, because the original moment is not a debate. It is a thing that happened to them, a brief intrusion, a shadow on the wall of childhood, a flash that still lights up the mind decades later. Let us slow down and walk through what is reported in the earliest interviews. A group of children say they saw a craft. Some say it landed. Some say it hovered. They describe a place beyond the yard, near the trees. They describe one or more beings. They describe the beings looking at them. Some describe a feeling that the being communicated without words. The children also describe their own reactions: fear, shock, confusion, a desire to run, a desire to stare. A few describe the being moving in a strange way, like it was bouncing or gliding. A few describe the being as having a face that felt not human. Some say the being wore black. Some say it was shiny. In a few accounts, the craft had a top and a bottom. In others, it was simple. In a few, there were multiple beings. In others, there was one. This spread of detail is normal, but it also makes it harder to build a single clean picture. Now, the strongest part of the case for many people is that the children were interviewed separately, and yet they still had overlapping themes. But we have to be honest about what we can and cannot confirm. We do not have a full controlled study. We do not have perfect records of who talked to who first. We do not have a time-stamped chain of custody for every drawing. We have a messy, real-world event. That is why I will treat each piece as a piece, not as a final verdict. We can also look at the setting. Ruwa is not in the middle of nowhere. It is not a sealed area. People can move. Vehicles can pass. Someone could approach the school grounds. Could it have been a small helicopter or plane? Some people mention that the children could have seen something like a small aircraft, or even a truck with a shiny object. But many of the children describe the object as being right there, not far away. So we have a tension. The more distant the object is, the easier it is to misidentify. The closer it is, the harder it is to explain away, but the harder it is to understand how adults did not confirm it. There are explanations for that too. Adults could have arrived after it was gone. Adults could have dismissed the story. Adults could have been inside. But we should keep that question alive. Where were the adults? What did they see? What did they do? Some accounts say teachers were in a meeting. Others say teachers came out after children ran inside shouting. If the event lasted only a short time, it could have ended before an adult got there. How long did it last? Some children describe it as a few minutes, some as longer. Memory can stretch time. Fear can make seconds feel like minutes, and minutes can feel like a long time when you are young. Now I want to widen the lens for a moment. In 1994, the world was filled with stories of UFOs. Newspapers had them, TV shows had them, movies had them. The image of a grey alien with big black eyes was already present. If a child sees something strange, what image do they reach for? They reach for the image they already know. That does not mean they did not see something. It means their brain labels the unknown with a known shape. This is a key idea in perception. The brain is not a camera. It is a prediction machine. It takes sensory input, mixes it with expectations, and produces a story. Sometimes the story matches reality. Sometimes it does not. So one careful way to hold the Ariel School incident is this. Something happened that startled the children. Their interpretation was shaped by the culture around them. The event was then reinforced by interviews, attention, and time. That could explain a lot. But does it explain everything? That depends on how you judge the early interviews. Some children seem sincere. Some seem frightened, even as they speak. Some do not seem like they are performing. Sincerity is not proof, but it is a signal. It tells us the children believe what they are saying. Belief can arise from a real event or a shared story. Now, consider the drawings again. A drawing is a translation. A child takes a memory, takes a feeling, and tries to put it on paper. The result will never be perfect, but patterns can still appear. If many children draw a similar shape, that is interesting. If many draw a similar figure, that is interesting. But we also know that children can copy each other, even if asked not to, even if separated, because they talk, they whisper, they share. We have to be cautious. Now, in later decades, the incident became a symbol. For believers, it is a powerful case. For skeptics, it is a case study in contagion. For the witnesses, it is their childhood. And those three groups do not always treat each other kindly. So the record is handled carefully, not as a debate, but as a quiet walk, a file on a shelf. It opens, it shows what it has, it closes. For now, keep your body still, let your breathing slow, and let the schoolyard appear in your mind as a simple place. Dust, sun, children, a fence line, and beyond it, a patch of trees, a quiet edge, a place where, for a moment, something strange was said to have appeared. Now, we return to the day itself. If you are listening in the dark, let it be like a reconstruction in your mind. The ordinary details come first, because that is what makes the unusual details stand out. Ariel School in 1994 had children from different backgrounds. Some were local Zimbabwean children. Some were children of families who had moved from other countries. In later interviews, some witnesses mentioned being from British or South African families. This detail matters because it speaks to language, media exposure, and the way children might describe things. The morning began like many mornings. Some children arrived in uniforms, some carried bags, some were sleepy, some were excited. A teacher would call them in. Lessons happened. Time passed. In many accounts, the key moment happens during late morning break. The teachers are said to be inside, and the children are outside. The number often given is around 60 children outside, but not all of them are direct witnesses. Some were younger and stayed closer to the building. Some were older and ran farther toward the edge of the yard. The story often begins with a few children noticing something beyond the playground. It is described as being near the bush line. Some say it was behind a line of trees. Some say it was in a field beyond a fence. The exact geography shifts depending on who is speaking. But the consistent idea is that it was close enough to see and far enough to feel like it was not fully within the safe zone. Children then ran to look. This is one of the most important human details. Children do not behave like investigators. They behave like children. They run toward the interesting thing. They gather in a group. They shout. They dare each other. They feel brave for a moment, and then fear hits, and then bravery returns, and then fear hits again. Many witnesses describe a wave pattern. Some children ran closer. Some ran back. Some froze. Some screamed. Some tried to see better. In the early interviews, several children describe the craft as something like a disc. Others describe it as something like a capsule. Some draw it as a flattened oval. Some at a dome. A few describe lights or a shimmer. A few mention that it seemed to move without making noise. Then the beings. A number of children describe one being. Some describe two. Some describe three. The most common description is of a small figure, with a large head and large dark eyes. This is the part that, for many listeners, triggers the cultural image of the grey alien. But the early interviews also include differences. Some children say the being had hair. Some say it did not. Some say it had a black suit. Some say it was shiny. Some say the skin was pale. Some say the skin was dark. One child in the early footage describes the being as having long black hair. Another describes a tight suit. Another describes a face that felt not human, with eyes that were intense. When we look at these differences, we can hold two ideas. First, difference can mean that memory is imperfect. Second, difference can mean that the event itself was hard to see clearly. If you see a small figure through heat haze at a distance, with fear in your body, your eyes do not deliver clean details. They deliver shapes and impressions can be strong. Some children described a feeling that the being looked directly into them. A few described a feeling of thoughts, like a message. We need to treat this carefully. In stressful events, the brain can produce a sense of meaning. The mind tries to answer the question, what is this? The mind tries to protect you by finding a pattern. Sometimes that pattern feels like it came from outside, because it arrives suddenly. So a thought can feel like it was placed in your mind. That does not prove it was. It explains how it can feel that way. Now, what happened next? Many accounts say children ran toward the teachers, screaming or crying. Teachers came outside. But by the time an adult arrived, the object and the beings were gone. This is an important point. Adult confirmation is one of the strongest forms of evidence we can have in a case like this. The lack of clear adult confirmation is one of the strongest skeptical points. But lack of confirmation is not the same as proof of no event. It can happen that an event is brief. If the craft, whatever it was only visible for a minute or two, that could be enough for children to see it and for adults to miss it. Still, it leaves a gap. What did the staff see? What did the staff do? In some accounts, staff believed the children were frightened. In others, staff were unsure what to think. Some staff later supported the idea that something odd occurred. Others stayed quiet. Soon after, journalists and investigators came. One of the reasons the Ariel School incident remains famous is that it did not wait decades to be documented. It was documented close to the time. In the footage, you see children being asked to describe what they saw. They draw pictures. They talk to adults. Their faces look serious. Some look nervous. Some look excited. Some look like they do not want to be there. This is not surprising. Being interviewed by adults can be intimidating. Now we come to John Mack. Mack was a respected psychiatrist. He also became a controversial figure because of his work with people who reported alien encounters. He did not begin with the idea that every story was true in a physical sense, but he was open to the idea that something real was happening in a way that did not fit normal categories. When Mack interviewed the children, he asked gentle questions. He asked them to draw, he asked them to describe. But we also have to be careful. Mack was not a neutral observer in the way a controlled research study would want. He was already invested in the possibility of non-human contact. So for skeptics, his involvement is a red flag. For believers, his involvement is a strong signal that the case is serious. For us, it is simply a fact. He interviewed them. We can listen to the material. We can note both the value and the limits. One of the most repeated parts of the later story is the idea that the children received a message about the environment and technology. Here is the careful framing. Some children reported a feeling that humanity was on the wrong path, that we were harming the earth, that technology could become dangerous, that people should slow down. These are themes that were present in society already. They were present in schools. They were present in media. So it is possible that children, faced with something unknown, projected a moral meaning onto it. It is also possible that they truly felt a message. We cannot prove the source. We can only confirm that the impression was reported. Now let us look at another context detail. Around that time, there were reports of a bright object in the sky over parts of southern Africa. Some people connect this to the school incident. They point to newspapers that mention a fireball or unusual lights. A bright fireball can be a meteor. It can be space debris. It can be something else. If a meteor happened, it could have primed people to talk about UFOs. It could also be unrelated. This is a pattern in UFO cases. A cluster of reports creates a sense that something is happening. It can be true, or it can be a social wave. Now we move into explanation territory. I will present the main explanations in a calm way. Explanation 1. A real but ordinary stimulus plus social contagion. In this model, there was a trigger, a person in the distance, a vehicle, a glint of light, a shadow, something that the children noticed. One or two children interpreted it as something strange. Fear spread. More children ran to look. As they talked, their descriptions aligned. This is not magic. It is normal human behavior. Children are especially vulnerable to this because they are social and imaginative. This explanation can account for the group nature. It can account for differences in detail. It can account for strong emotions. It can also account for why adults did not see it. But it has challenges. It has to explain why the children produced drawings with similar shapes. It has to explain why some witnesses, decades later, still feel certain. It has to explain why the event seems to have had a coherent narrative quickly. Explanation 2. A hoax or prank. In this model, someone intentionally created the appearance of a craft or being, maybe a person in a costume, maybe a local story, maybe a joke that went too far. This explanation is often suggested in UFO cases, but it also has challenges. It requires a prankster who got close enough, in daylight, near a school, without being caught. It requires the prankster to keep quiet forever. It requires equipment or costume that would not be noticed. It is possible, but it is not an easy fit. Explanation 3. A misinterpretation of a real aircraft or vehicle. Some people suggest a small helicopter, or a small plane, or something like a crop duster, but the children describe the object being close to the ground near the bush. A helicopter could land quickly and leave, but a helicopter makes noise. Most children would mention the noise. Some do mention a kind of sound or hum. Many do not. So again, it is a partial fit. Explanation 4. Something unknown. This is the explanation that keeps the case alive for believers. Many witnesses, early interviews, coherent imagery, strong emotional memory. For people who already believe that non-human visitors exist, Ariel School becomes a rare case with children as witnesses and with early media. But even if something unknown happened, we still have to define unknown. Unknown could mean a rare natural event. Unknown could mean experimental technology. Unknown could mean something else. The leap to extraterrestrial visitors is a leap. It may be true, but it is not forced. Now we can talk about memory. Memory is one of the hardest parts of this case because the witness accounts span decades. If you have never had a memory change, you might think of memory as stable. But science shows memory is reconstructive. When you remember something, you rebuild it. Each rebuild can change it a little. Not because you choose to lie, because the brain is not a storage box, it is a story engine. So if a witness is interviewed many times, their story can become smoother. It can become more consistent. But that consistency can come from practice. It can also come from reinforcement. The story becomes a script, and the script can drift from the original raw memory. Now add another factor: public attention. Some witnesses became known as the kids who saw a UFO. That identity can be heavy. It can also be rewarding. It can create pressure. If you are that child and adults keep asking you, "What did you see?" you might feel that you must have seen something huge. You might feel you cannot disappoint. You might also feel you must defend yourself. So the memory becomes defended. And defended memories are hard to question. This is why, when we watch adult interviews of the witnesses, we should be kind. They are not only describing an event, they are describing years of being questioned. Now, I want to return to the emotional center again. Even if the craft was not extraterrestrial, the children were scared. That fear is real. It is recorded in their voices. The moment mattered. So we can honor that without declaring the conclusion. Let us imagine the scene once more, slower. The sun is high. The air is warm. You can feel dry grass. You can hear voices. Someone points. A cluster forms. The world narrows. In the distance, a shape, a bright surface, a dark edge, and then a figure. Your mind does not have a clean label, so it reaches alien, spirit, monster, man, anything. Your body goes cold. You want to run, but you keep looking. Then you run. Then you come back. Then you run again. This is a very human rhythm. Now, the incident later became part of a larger UFO narrative. It is often compared to other mass witness events. But Ariel School is unique because the witnesses were children. Children are trusted in some ways because they are seen as less likely to fabricate a complex lie. But children are also less reliable in some ways because they are more suggestible. So the fact of childhood cuts both ways. Now, we can ask a practical question. If a craft landed near a school in daylight, why? Why choose that place? Why allow children to see? Why leave no physical trace? Believers sometimes answer by saying the visitors did not care about being seen, or that it was deliberate contact. Skeptics answer by saying that the lack of trace suggests the event was not physical. Again, both are possible. Now we can look at physical evidence. As far as public records show, there is no confirmed physical trace like scorched ground or recovered material that was verified by independent analysis. That absence is another skeptical point, but physical traces are rare in many alleged encounters, so it is not a decisive point by itself. Now we can look at the way the story travelled. In the years after 1994, the incident was mentioned in UFO books and programs. Then, in the internet era, it became easier to find. Clips were uploaded, documentaries were made, podcasts discussed it, and the story reached new audiences. With each wave, the story gained weight. With each wave, it also gained noise. Some retellings exaggerate, some simplify, some add details. This is why I keep returning to the early material. If you want to understand Ariel School, you start as close to 1994 as you can. Now, I want to talk about a careful way to treat witness consistency. If multiple witnesses say similar things, we do not automatically call it proof. But we also do not automatically dismiss it. We note it. We ask, could they have influenced each other? We ask, were the interviews done separately? We ask, how quickly did the narrative form? We ask, what parts were common and what parts varied? In Ariel School, the common parts include a craft or strange object near the bush, a small figure or figures, a feeling of fear, a feeling of being watched. The variable parts include color, hair, number of beings, exact shape, exact distance. This pattern is consistent with many real-world events. It could match a shared stimulus. It could match a shared story. It could match a mixture. Now, as we come toward the end of this record, I want to speak softly to the listener without breaking the documentary tone. The point of this episode is not to tell you what to believe. The point is to let you rest inside uncertainty, to notice how a story can be both vivid and unresolved, to notice how people can carry a mystery for life, and to notice how the world can contain events that we cannot fully explain. Sometimes the explanation is ordinary, sometimes it is not, and sometimes we never know. If you are listening for sleep, you do not need to solve it tonight. You only need to let the story settle, like dust after a sudden run, like heat after a bright day. Now we return one last time to the schoolyard. The children are older now in our minds. The yard is quiet. The trees are still. The moment is gone. What remains is the record, a handful of drawings, a handful of interviews, a debate that continues, and a human memory that refuses to fade. There is a way to hold this story that is gentle. We can say, something happened. We can say, the witnesses felt it. We can say, the world listened. We can say, we still do not know, and we can let that be enough. We can close the folder. We can place it back on the shelf. We can step away, slowly, quietly. Now, one more layer before we end. We can also look at what it means for a story to be shared by children who later become adults. When you are a child, you live in the present. You feel things intensely, but you do not always place them in time. Years can pass, and the memory stays the same size. When you become an adult, you begin to place the memory inside a life. You say, that happened when I was 7, or that happened when I was 9. You say, it happened before I moved. You say, it happened before my parents divorced. You say it happened when the country was changing. You connect it to a timeline, and that connection can change the way it feels. Some people report that the Ariel School incident became more meaningful as they got older. They began to read about UFOs. They began to search for other stories. They began to see patterns. Other people report the opposite. They tried to forget it. They tried to treat it as a strange childhood scare. But the story kept returning because people kept asking. So the memory becomes a kind of echo. Now think about this from a simple human angle. If you are interviewed about a strange childhood event, you may start to wonder if your life would have been different without it. If you say yes, it becomes a turning point. If you say no, it becomes a curiosity. Either way, the act of being asked makes it part of you. This can lead to two different kinds of pressure. Pressure 1, to stay consistent. If you say a detail one time and later you forget, you may feel you must keep the detail anyway. Pressure 2, to improve the story. If you notice the interviewer is interested in a certain detail, you may lean into it. Again, not as a lie, as a human response to attention. This is why the best interview method is gentle, open, and non-leading. And it is why early, raw interviews matter. Now, there is also the simple fact that children can be honest and still be wrong. They can misperceive, they can misremember, they can misunderstand. That is not an insult. It is a fact about all humans. Adults do this too, but children do it with less experience. Now, some listeners ask a different question. If this was social contagion, why did some children refuse to join the story? In many accounts, not every child claimed to see the beings. Some saw lights, some saw nothing, some only heard about it. This split can support the contagion model, because contagion rarely infects everyone. It can also support the stimulus model, because a real stimulus can be seen by some and missed by others. So the split is again not decisive. Now consider another subtle detail. In some early accounts, children described a being as moving in a jerky way, or as if it was hopping. This is interesting because it does not match a smooth Hollywood alien. It sounds like a child trying to describe something that does not fit. But it could also be a child describing a person moving behind brush, appearing and disappearing. When you only see fragments, motion can feel strange. Now, if you want one very simple lens that can fit a lot of the evidence without becoming extreme, it is this. There was a real stimulus. It was unusual enough to catch attention. It was unclear enough to allow imagination. Fear spread. The group formed a narrative. The narrative was reinforced by interviews. The memory became stable. The story lasted. This lens does not prove the stimulus was ordinary. It only shows how an unclear event can become a lasting mystery. Now, if you want a different lens, a believer lens, it is this. The children saw something real and non-human. Adults missed it because it was brief. The early interviews captured genuine witness accounts. The consistency across many children suggests a real event. The environmental impression suggests a communication. This lens is possible. It is not proven, but it is coherent, and that is why the debate continues. Now we can return to the public life of the story. But first, one last simple grounding step. If you were an investigator arriving after the fact, what would you do? You would ask for a written list of names. You would ask who was present outside. You would ask who first noticed the object. You would ask where each child stood. You would ask what direction they looked. You would ask who ran toward the bush and who stayed back. You would ask who spoke to who first. You would ask what the teachers saw when they came outside. You would ask if any neighbors saw anything. You would ask if any aircraft were heard. You would ask if any vehicles were near the school. You would check weather conditions. You would check visibility. You would check if there was wind that could create dust or shimmer. You would take photos of the area. You would look for marks. You would note the time. Then you would do something that is hard. You would interview children without leading them. You would use open questions. You would accept uncertainty. You would not reward dramatic details. You would not punish confusion. You would let the child describe what they saw in their own words. In the real world, this is rarely done perfectly. So we should not demand perfection from 1994. We should only be aware of what it means. The record is imperfect. The mystery remains. And because the record is imperfect, people fill the gaps with their own beliefs. That is human. Now we can return to the public life of the story. We can look at how a story like this becomes a public object. At first, it belongs to the witnesses. It is a private memory. It is something you tell your family, if you tell anyone at all. Then it becomes a school matter. Adults ask questions. Teachers try to calm children. Parents ask what happened. Then it becomes a media story. A journalist arrives. A camera is set up. Microphones are held close to small faces. The story is shaped into a segment. Then it becomes a global story. It crosses borders. It gets translated. It gets placed beside other UFO cases. It becomes part of a larger argument. And in that process, something strange happens. The witnesses become less like people and more like symbols. One side uses them as proof. The other side uses them as an example. And the witnesses are left carrying the weight. If you have ever had a moment from your childhood repeated back to you by strangers, you know how surreal that can feel. You do not only remember the event, you remember the way people reacted. You remember the way the story changed as it left your mouth and entered someone else's. So when a witness from Ariel School speaks today, they are speaking through layers. The original moment, the first retelling, the interviews, the documentaries, the online comments, the memes, the arguments, all of it. This can change a person. It can make them more defensive. It can make them more careful. It can also make them more certain, because certainty feels safer than being pulled apart. Now, a few people who study memory point to another effect. When you repeatedly tell a story, you create a stable narrative. The narrative becomes easier to recall than the raw memory. Over time, you may remember the narrative more than the moment. This is not a moral failure. It is normal. But it matters in cases like this, because the story becomes polished. And polished stories can sound like rehearsed lies, even when they are honest. Or they can sound like strong truth, even when they contain drift. So again, we return to the careful approach. The most valuable material is the earliest, but the later material is still humanly important. Now, let us ask another grounded question. If the event was a misunderstanding, why did it focus on the idea of a being? Children could have said they saw a plane. They could have said they saw a man. But many described a being that felt not human. One answer is that the human mind, when faced with a strange stimulus, often creates an agent. It creates a watcher. It creates a figure. This is called agent detection. It is an old survival feature. If you see movement in the bushes, it is safer to assume it is something alive. So the mind leans toward beings. If the stimulus was a real object near the bush, the mind could add the being. Another answer is that the stimulus really did include a being, maybe a person, maybe someone in dark clothing, maybe a worker, maybe a visitor. A figure seen briefly at a distance could look strange, especially if the child is already primed to expect something uncanny. Now, one more question. Why did the story last? Many childhood stories fade. Many playground dramas are forgotten. Why did this one stay? Because it was tied to fear. Fear locks memory. Because it was tied to attention. Attention reinforces memory. Because it was tied to identity. Identity protects memory. And because the story connects to a bigger mystery that many people already care about. Are we alone? So Ariel School became a small window into a big question. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Skepticism is not cruelty. It is possible to doubt a claim and still treat the witness with respect. It is possible to say, I do not know what you saw, and I believe you believe it. That is a kind way to hold a mystery. Belief is not naivety either. It is possible to think something unknown happened and still be careful with evidence. The best minds can hold curiosity and doubt at the same time. Now, we can place the Ariel School incident beside other cases, not to prove anything, but to see patterns. In many cases, groups report lights in the sky. In fewer, groups report beings. In a handful, there are early interviews. In an even smaller handful, the witnesses are children. So Ariel is rare, but rare does not mean alien. It means rare. Now, we can also notice that many UFO stories become more elaborate over time. They gain more details. They gain more meaning. They gain more certainty. This is a human pattern. So if you ever feel a story getting larger and larger, you can pause and ask, which details were present at the start? Which were added later? Which are stable? Which are flexible? This method does not solve the mystery. It helps you treat it wisely. Now, if you are listening for sleep, you can let these thoughts drift. You do not have to hold them. You can let them pass like slow clouds. A school, a yard, a bush line, a bright shape, a dark figure, a feeling, a memory, a record, and a world that does not always explain itself. Before we end, we can take a slower look at what the interviews actually do and do not tell us. An interview is not a mirror. It is a tool. The moment you ask a question, you shape the answer. If you ask a child, what did you see? You invite a story. If you ask, was it a UFO? You invite a label. If you ask, did it have big eyes? You invite a specific image. So when we watch early interviews from Ariel School, we should notice the questions as much as the answers. Some of the early footage shows children being asked open questions. Some moments are more leading. This is not unusual in journalism. Journalists want a clear story. They want a headline. They want a clean quote. But the truth of a strange event is rarely clean. The most useful parts of the early footage are often the parts where a child searches for words, where they pause, where they show confusion, where they point instead of naming. Those pauses can be real. They can also be the normal pause of a child being asked to speak on camera. Again, both can be true. Now consider the drawings. Drawings are often treated like evidence, but drawings are also influenced. If a child sees another child's drawing, they may adopt the same features. If an adult says, "Draw what you saw," the child may feel pressure to draw something coherent. If a child cannot remember a detail, they may fill it in. Filling in does not mean lying. It means completing a picture. This is why, in careful investigations, the best evidence is the earliest, least influenced record. In the Ariel case, we have early records. That is a strength, but we do not have perfect controls. That is a weakness. Now, one of the most common skeptical explanations is mass psychogenic influence, sometimes called mass hysteria. That phrase sounds harsh. It sounds like the children were crazy. That is not what it means. It means that, in groups, fear and belief can spread. It means that people can share a story and then experience it as real. It can happen in schools. It can happen in factories. It can happen in towns. It does not require anyone to be broken. It only requires people to be human. But mass psychogenic influence usually has certain patterns. It often spreads symptoms like fainting, headaches, or panic. It often follows stress. In Ariel School, the main output is a story of a sighting, not a wave of physical symptoms. So some skeptics prefer a simpler model. A few children saw something. They told others. Others believed. The story spread. Some children then honestly believed they saw it too. This is more like rumor, contagion, than classic mass hysteria. Another skeptical model is confabulation. Confabulation is when the brain fills gaps and creates a false memory that feels real. Confabulation can happen when a person is pressured to recall. It can happen when people want an answer. It can happen when the mind is trying to make sense. In Ariel's school, children were asked to recall quickly and then again later. That can create space for confabulation. But again, confabulation does not automatically explain everything. It is one tool. Now, one reason the Ariel case is so sticky is that it sits at a crossroad of three things. First, it has many witnesses. Second, it involves children. Third, it has early recordings. If any one of those things were missing, the case would be easier to dismiss. Many UFO stories have only one witness. Some have only adult witnesses. Many have no early recording. Ariel has all three. That is why it returns. Now, to keep ourselves grounded, we can ask what a responsible conclusion looks like. A responsible conclusion might be: a group of children reported a strange event. Some interviews were recorded close to the time. The children appear sincere. There is no confirmed physical evidence. Adult confirmation is limited. The story has changed in some details over time. Therefore, the event remains unexplained, but not proven as extraterrestrial. That is a careful conclusion, but people often want more. They want yes or no. Was it real? Was it a hoax? Was it aliens? And that desire for certainty is part of why these stories become heated. Now let us look at what the adult witnesses have said in recent years. Some have said they still believe it was real. Some have said they are not sure what it was. Some have said they do not like the attention. Some have expressed frustration with how the story is used. This range is also normal. People grow. People reinterpret. People protect themselves. Now, there is another factor. In the decades since 1994, the idea of the grey alien has become even more common. If a witness talks about big eyes today, it is easier for listeners to picture exactly what they mean. That can make the story feel clearer, even if the original memory was not. So time can sharpen a story, even as it makes it less reliable. Now we can also consider cultural context in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has its own traditions and stories about strange beings, spirits, and the unknown. But the Ariel School case is often framed in Western UFO language. This framing could be because some witnesses came from Western backgrounds. It could be because journalists used that language. It could be because the UFO narrative was already global. But it is worth remembering that the same event could be interpreted differently in different cultures. A being in the bush could be a spirit, a creature, an ancestor, an alien, a person. The label depends on the mind that sees it. Now we can ask another practical question. Why do some people love this case? Because it has a feeling. It feels clean. It feels like a pure witness moment. Kids in a yard. No reason to lie. No military motives. No money. Just fear and drawings. That simplicity is powerful. But simplicity can also be misleading, because schools are social systems. Children influence each other. Adults influence children. Media influences everyone. So the simple picture still contains many forces. Now, some people point to the idea that the children were interviewed separately and therefore could not have influenced each other. But separation is rarely perfect. Children talk before the interview. Children talk after. Children can hear things. Adults can suggest things. So we should not treat separation as a magic guarantee. Instead, we treat it as a partial protection. Another point believers sometimes make is that the children were from different backgrounds, so they would not all share the same fantasy. But children share the same media world. They share the same school. They share the same group fear. So background differences do not erase contagion. They only make it a bit more interesting. Now let us look at one more subtle detail. Some children describe the being moving in a strange, almost floating way. This detail appears in other encounter reports too. It can be interpreted as something non-human, but it can also be a memory artifact. When you are frightened, your perception of motion can distort. A person walking behind brush can look like a glide. A figure at a distance can look like it moves without steps. So again, the detail is interesting, but not decisive. Now we can ask, what would we want if we could go back? We would want a map of the school grounds. We would want the exact positions of children. We would want a timeline. We would want adult statements. We would want to know what was happening in the sky that day. We would want to know if any aircraft were nearby. We would want to know if any unusual events were reported locally. We would want to know if any footprints or marks were seen. We would want a careful investigator with experience in interviewing children. We do not have all of that. We have a partial record, so we accept the limits. Now let us settle the record into a calm final shape. A schoolyard in Zimbabwe, a group of children, a reported object, reported beings, early interviews, later interviews, no final proof, no final disproof, a story that sits in the mind and the night still around you. As you listen, your body can be heavy, your breathing can be slow. You do not need to decide. You only need to let the file close. The shelf returns to silence. The room returns to darkness. And the story can drift away like dust in warm air. If you notice your mind trying to grab the story again, you can let it loosen. You can remind yourself that a mystery does not have to be solved to be set down. You can remind yourself that the world contains many half-seen things. Not only UFO stories, but ordinary moments too. A face you almost recognize. A sound in the night that you never identify. A dream that leaves a feeling without a plot. Those moments do not harm you when you let them pass. They only become heavy when you carry them like a task. So let this be a story that does not become a task. Let the schoolyard fade. Let the sunlight fade. Let the bush line fade. Let the object, whatever it was, fade. Let the questions fade. If you still feel a small knot of curiosity, you can soften it with a simple thought. We do not have to know everything. Most of life is lived without final answers. People move through days with partial information. They make choices. They raise children. They build friendships. They lose things. They find things. They learn. They forget. They keep going. So a strange report from a schoolyard does not need to become a puzzle you hold in your hands. It can be a story you heard, a record you visited, a file you set back on the shelf. And now the shelf can close. The room can be quiet, and your attention can sink down and away from the edges, and let your body stay here, safe, in this room, with the night around you. In a way, this is the quiet lesson inside many mysteries. Not that the unknown is always safe, not that every story is true, but that the mind can learn to rest even when it cannot complete the picture. You can let your thoughts slow down. You can let your jaw loosen. You can let your shoulders drop. You can feel the weight of the bed or the chair. And you can imagine the archive itself as a calm building at night. Long halls, dim lights, rows of shelves, each shelf holding a story that someone once carried and then released. This one is released now. If there was a real object in that field, it is long gone. If there was only a misunderstanding, the fear was still real. Either way, the children grew up. The school kept having school days. Zimbabwe kept moving through time, and the planet kept turning under a sky that does not always explain itself. So we let the record be a record. We can hold two truths at once. The story matters to the people who lived it, and the evidence is not enough for a final verdict. That balance is not weakness. It is honesty. It means you can respect the witnesses without turning the story into a religion, and you can question the claim without treating anyone like a joke. You can simply say, something was reported, something was felt, something was remembered, and the rest is open. And now, in this moment, you can rest, gently and quietly. We do not squeeze it until it gives a final answer. We let it sit in its own shape, and then we let it go. A final image remains for a moment. Not an answer, an image. The kind of image that feels older than memory, like it was waiting in the dark of the world and briefly stepped forward. For some witnesses, the craft is not remembered as a machine. It is remembered as a sign, a presence that arrived with its own quiet authority, something that did not need to threaten, because the strangeness alone was enough. And the beings are not remembered as monsters. They are remembered as visitors from a place that is not ours, a place that does not share our rules, a place that looks back at us with eyes that feel like mirrors. In that kind of moment, the mind stops arguing. It simply receives. It feels small. It feels seen. Then, just as quickly, the world seals again, and what is left behind is the strangest residue of all. Not smoke, not footprints, not metal, a feeling. A thin place in the mind where certainty used to be. A quiet knowledge that reality may be wider than the shapes we draw around it, and that the sky can watch back for a moment. A schoolyard in sunlight, a fence line, a strip of brush, a handful of children, frozen between curiosity and fear. Then the moment passes, the yard empties, the day goes on, lunch is served, lessons continue, a bus arrives, parents pick up their children. A normal afternoon settles back over the school, and the air holds no sign of what was seen, only the feeling left behind. The grass is still, the trees are still, the sky is just a sky. Years roll forward, and the story becomes a small, stubborn spark inside memory. Now even that spark can dim. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,